Hello, all, and I apologize for my somewhat lengthy absence. I've been pretty preoccupied lately in my life, so want to get back to form and on track here. And so, this video is going to be mainly introduction to the actual philosophical conversations and principles that are going on in the pre-Socratic period, about 200 years or so, from Thales to Socrates himself. And so, within these conversations and ideas from these thinkers at the time, one of the more basic conversation pieces that we're going to look at today is, what are these elements? What are the fundamental processes that are needed for change or consistency in the world? And of course, as we've been looking at on the channel, beginning really of the scientific endeavor of understanding the world as we see it, these conversations are paramount at the time to really understand what the Greeks are trying to do here. And so these philosophical discussions really get going in the more outreached Greek colonies. And I think one of the reasons for that, and really the development of ideas throughout history, is where you look at the locations of where a lot of trade is happening. And so we see in these Greek colonies that there is a robust trading system being developed between the East and the West. Anywhere you have a lot of trade, you have a lot of people gathering around, you're going to have not just the exchange of goods and services, but you're also going to have the exchange of ideas. And so I think that's one of the more legitimate reasoning behind why some of the more remote, if you will, colonies at the time were necessary to have these philosophical and ideas really to start developing. And so they're basically asking the questions of what is basically stuff? What is the world really made of? What is the natural world and its account that's moving away from the Homeric myths that their predecessors had supposed for changes in the world? So, what are the elements of and what really makes up the cosmic order we observe in nature, and how it's ordered, how there's consistency, but there's also always change. And the question is the order of the cosmos. If there is an ordering process, then rationally, is there any sort of morality to it? And this is, of course, an ethical question. And so, how do we explain morality and how it complements not just the way the structures around the world are to be, but how that looks within ourselves? And there's really two philosophical accounts of thought and to really discuss here, and that is the reflection of physical principles, how change is occurring in a scientific account, and the other is of the moral order that exists in the process of nature itself. And so, moving to the distinction between these pre-Socratic philosophers and how they're going to go about not just answering these questions, but how they actually come about to these questions themselves, how they're going to go about this. You have two distinctions really of the monistic philosophers and the pluralist philosophers. And so they're really asking, do we have one basic element account of the world? Is there a basic principle or an ingredient, if you will, that really makes up stuff around us? Or is it a plurality? Is there multiple elements out there? The other question is there one basic quantity or sphere? And they're somewhat hinting at how the Earth is round, if you will. Or do we have many distinguished things in the world? Is there, difference or something of that nature? And if so, how many elements are there? How many variations give possibility to actual changes to begin with? And now I want to hone in on perhaps the father of this thinking, or is the father of this thinking, sorry, and that is Thales. And Thales believed that life is derived from water as the ultimate supposition of life as we know it. Of course, in order for us to sustain ourselves, in order for agriculture to take place, there has to be a sufficient amount of water. But the properties of water vary all the time. There's adaptations to different situations around it, such as steam, or when it gets too cold and it solidifies. And so you have liquid and vapor. And we notice that this is essential to life, that Thales wants to point out to us. So for Thales, it's the element of water. And then you have Anaximander, who recognized that we have a plurality, if you will, between the oppositions to water. So we have, water, and then we have a drought. We have dryness. And so he sees the polarities within the actual qualities of these elements themselves, such as light and dark, male and female. And if you have opposition properties, then how can we have one true basic definition that encompasses, just a singular element? We have oppositions, and they can't really be privileged, if you will, to have one over the other. Now, where exactly did they get the idea, if you will, of elements really being important to understand phenomena? And of course, this goes back to the literature, the tragedies, the myths that their predecessors had put forth. And so we see philosophy here emerging as the observation of natural causes, but nonetheless, there still is that bit of influence of the myths, even though they're attempting to overthrow it culturally with trying to revert away from the Homeric education, if you will, to something a bit more sophisticated with the natural sciences, or at least the start of this here. And so those earlier myths and literary forms influenced really the beginnings of science, and that's one of the main reasons why I chose to focus on history with Thucydides and his account, and really the start of a sort of social science, and of course with Hippocrates and how he started to study diseases in this scientific method. Nonetheless, there still is that little bit of influence from the myths that you have with the earth, air, fire, and water that we saw for many centuries before these philosophers come along. And then moving to our next thinker, we have Heraclitus. And Heraclitus is influenced by the idea of fire and warmth. And of course, this is going to be influential for the Stoic school to come after, with their affinity to fire and warmth. And Heraclitus, of course, is famous for the changing principle, because the elements are, of course, morphing on a situational basis amongst those building blocks of elements of the world. And so change becomes very important for Heraclitus. And then we have Pythagoras, who, of course, if you had a basic education, which I'm sure everyone has had who's watching this, Pythagoras is famous for being the mathematician of the 90-degree angle, and how you can add up the other sides to get the same amount. Pythagoras has a very interesting idea that says that mathematics really is a sort of language of the world, and it's interesting how Pythagoras and Heraclitus, it doesn't appear that they talk to each other really, or knew of each other, but they both have this sort of fixation of the processes that are within polarities, within nature, both with the vital aspects and how they thought about these elements and how change plays a part in that. Now, Pythagoras has a very interesting story, or an anecdote, if you will, that I always thought was fascinating and just shows how sophisticated, even though many people discredit the ancients or just see these people as primitive. Pythagoras is very smart and notices one day when he's passing by and astutely observes a blacksmith that the relationship of the size of the hammer on the metals that are being used by the blacksmith shop, they make different noises based on the density of those metals. And he uses this really to understand how mathematics really, or at least its relationship with the senses and how we hear the hammer and the metals, has a sort of language to it, or at least it gives a sort of structure to understand how density, how something like the weight of the hammer or the weight of the metals would play a role in our sense perception. And so, as we focus on change here with these pluralists, we do come across the question of how can everything be in a sort of process if everything's always changing in the natural world? How do we have predictability then? And fire is a sort of metaphor for Heraclitus, that it's always in the flux of changes. But as the monists would bring up, we have regularity with changes, and therefore we have ordering. For Heraclitus, it is the example of fire and the power that logos gives us. And with Pythagoras, it is changes to the ordering of the mathematical principles themselves. And so to deal with processes, we as rational beings, of course the Greeks considered us as rational beings, we must order it in accordance to our knowledge. And this is kind of a quick detour to how we will get to the pre-Socratic ethics. If the world has an ordering to it, then of course we should live in accordance to that ordering, and therefore we should be rational beings in a rational world. And so on the contrary, Parmenides rejects the idea of having a double aspect that the two thinkers before us gave us, and he declares rather radically that change is illusory, and therefore so is plurality. Physical motion then is an illusion, and the senses are simply the way of a sort of illusion. It's kind of like, as we'll get to later, never leaving the Platonic cave. You're always just in this illusory state if you don't think things through with abstractions as a way of actually understanding matters of fact. You're just really at the beckoning of whatever shapes and the Heraclitean fire, if you will, it's casting shadows onto the cave. You're just going to be pulled in all these different directions unless you're thinking rationally, unless you actually understand in an abstract way the ordering of the universe. And that's what Parmenides is really trying to get at. Xenophon, on the other hand, uses these paradoxes of physical properties as a way to pose for a monistic view as opposed to a pluralistic view. Change in these paradoxical states is absurd insofar that it is just a contradiction. If we're using logos, then we're going to have a lot of contradictions with how change happens. And so Zeno asks to show the absurdity of how pluralism is by giving us this simple thought exercise of is the lightest seed a millet? The millet seed doesn't make a sound on its own, and of course no, because it's the lightest seed. But if you have an entire sack filled with them, it should still make no sound if we're being logical about this. But nonetheless, if you throw down a whole burr sack full of these seeds, you're going to hear a loud thud. And for Zeno, this is a contradiction that cannot be followed logically. Rationally, it shouldn't be possible, and this demonstrates the illusion that the senses can give to us. And so the plurality, or changes, if you will, are illusory, such as motion from a strictly logical standpoint. We cannot really have change if we're just deducing this in a logical way, as his example shows. And despite its radical claims of changes and sense being illusion, everything can't just be a sort of plurality, though. It would be just all disjunctive. There would be no way to have any sort of ordering or predictability to it. And so you're seeing here this division that, you can't really have one side or the other. There's obviously changes in the world. There's a lot of disjunction, because of course there's the unexpected. There's something like a miracle or something that happens, or something illuminates to you that blows your mind, that you nobody could have accounted for before. But nonetheless, in many aspects, doesn't take too much thought about it, but we have a predictability. We know the sun will rise and will set in the same direction, and so there's clearly order, but there's also change as well. And so you have the predicament really with a lot of these pre-Socratics with the pluralist and the monistic discussions here, because it doesn't seem right that it would be radically one or the other. And so the pre-Socratics here could be thought of the play on questioning. Of course, when it comes to the answers themselves, just like many times in the history of philosophy, it's really the questioning, it's the critical analysis of other people's answers more than perhaps the solutions themselves. And this is really a theme for philosophy, I would say. And so many of the other pluralists, particularly we have Empedocles, Anaxagoras, and Democritus. And so Empedocles works with those four elements in a sort of togetherness, in a plurality of processes of how we can have a cosmic history. And so from those elements to the history of the universe, the drivers are a sort of attraction, a sort of love and hate that he talks about, or a repulsion. So even when a certain quality, if you will, lacks an element, there is a sort of relationship, cosmically speaking, to lack that element, to repulse it. And when you have a lot of quantities, if you will, within a quality, then you have a sort of attraction that is being built there. And so Anaxagoras uses the basic elements of all qualitative things through what he calls the seed. The seed is not specifically, perhaps, as we'll get to with Democritus, the sort of atom, but with the seed we have the elements of something like the body with its flesh and blood. There's different seedlings that give the body its sort of unity, or for the universe as a whole, it's a sort of origin point, if you will. And Anaxagoras uses the word nous, which in Greek is to be translated to mind, to explain that we have a sort of cosmic mind that draws the ordering out of the disjunctiveness that we see in the natural world. So the divine mind Anaxagoras is invoking could be seen as a sort of divine supreme being, and an origin point for where we're going to start seeing theology pick up in ancient Greece. And then moving to Democritus, he's has a distinction all to his own, away from the other qualitative pluralists. Democritus, in a rather smart way, is a qualitative monist, everything is of one and the same quality, but the quantities have changes and a whole assortment of processes, even though qualitatively he is a monist. And so we're seeing him in some regards trying to work on how it doesn't seem that you could have just a universe of just pure monism or a universe of pure plurality. There's something like the atom that qualitatively is the same, but their atoms have a sort of plurality to it, was they use and build up into different changes in the world. And so on the physical, we're composed of those infinite atoms and indivisible unit, which is what the intention of the wording of atoms, that cannot really be described. And there's vast differences, and the qualitative difference of these atoms are due to the relationship of combinations of these units that produce them. Because of course atoms come in all different shapes in the sort of motion and collision, and combine to form greater aggregates, and are a sheer chance or a sort of mechanical process. And so to really summarize here, Anaxagoras is a concept of a teleological, of the cosmic mind that orders things through its intelligence, whereas Democritus offers a much more blind, mechanistic chance orientation, and those forces combine to form aggregates that make up the cosmos as we see it. And moving along then, the Pre-Socratics from Thales to Socrates himself is only about 2 centuries, which these conversations that we just discussed in this video is really an outline of what Western thought is to be since the scientific innovations begin with this very pre-Socratic thinking during this time period. You have things like the philosophy of nature or natural philosophy that the pre-Socratics are starting to play with here and offer us the origin point for what's to come with empirical thought and mathematical development that dominate really not just Greece but the medieval time periods to go along with that, and even up to really the 20th century with things like psychology, history, and science, of course, itself. And so we're still ultimately asking these very questions of what produces change and consistency, but of course they're filtered through with these different disciplines, and this can be traced back to these very conversations. This is why I think this video is so important, and more than that, just these thinkers and ideas in general that we're discussing today. And so there are, of course, 2 distinct categories under the field of philosophy that we're seeing here the Pre-Socratics starting to unravel for us, and that is metaphysics and epistemology. And so at the forefront of these discussions, we have the beginnings of the mind-body relationship. Sense experience cannot be trusted ultimately at all times, and there is an issue really with the differences between senses and what is rational. And for that matter, in the natural field of it, is matter existent in and of itself? And what is the state of the supreme being? What is the relationship of the cosmos, or the ordering, if you will? Who is doing the ordering then? And when it comes to epistemology, which of course is the theory of knowledge, we have the beginnings of the ancient empiricists, which come from sense experience, such as Thales and the pluralists. And then of course we have that distinction with the rationalists like Parmenides and Zeno, which differ away from the pluralist and sense perception as an illusion. And reliable knowledge is only to come about abstractly and rationally. And so these questions, these distinctions here, pose between the reliability of experience and the infallibly of abstract reasoning itself. And then moving to the ethic and social theory, we have Pythagoras or Heraclitus that say we should have accordance to live rationally in a world that is rational. But even for Democritus, who has that mechanistic sort of chaos chance theory, to go all the way back to postmodernism on the channel, he nonetheless believes that the rational life is worth living in a mechanical world because we have the distinction of those very forces. They may themselves be a thing of chance or chaos, but the outcomes give us grief or pleasure. And if we can understand enough about these changes, about the mechanistic world, then we can get a leg up on those processes. Then we can perhaps minimize ethically the pain for pleasure with a rational guidance. This nonetheless is going to end the video here with asking one of the most famous questions of Greek philosophy, which is, what is the good? And we'll start picking up on that on the next video. So I hope you guys enjoyed this brief introduction of all of the different pre-Socratic philosophers that dominated their time period or had some sort of influence, and the distinctions and sort of conversations that they're having at the time, and its really influence over the world as we know it.